The state-owned enterprises in China are funded primarily by state-owned banks. This leads to political lending, where loans are made based on political rather than economic factors. That means that the government often gets its projects through, whereas there's less funds available for private businesses to get their projects through, which helps explain why China has been so successful in building up its major cities, because there's so much funding that is coming from these banks to the state enterprises to build those roads and to build those iconic skyscrapers and so on and so forth. But there's less funds available for everyday ordinary people funding small businesses. You can also see this in the rates of returns that banks get relative to other state-owned enterprises. It's significantly different. State-owned banks in China have very low returns, close to zero on their investments, whereas the energy company in China, the oil company in China, the heavy steel and iron industries, they have double-digit rates of return or close to that. So why the difference? Because the government is purposely pushing returns down for the banks so that these other state-owned enterprises have easy access and cheap access to funding to grow the oil industry, to grow the energy industry, to grow the iron and steel industry. You might be inclined to say that this sounds like monetary policy in the US and other parts of the world. And that's true. The Federal Reserve, our central bank, does push down interest rates to the disadvantage of banks, right? They get a lower return, and to the advantage of non-banks, other businesses that get cheap access to funding. The difference is the low interest rates that the Fed pushes down advantages all businesses, most of them private, small and large. Whereas in China, the low interest rates benefit the state-owned enterprises, which happen to be the largest companies in the country. You can see this in terms of China's economic growth. Much of the improvements have coalesced in the major cities like Beijing and Shanghai, where the government has greater influence and wants to impress the world. Both those cities, along with a few others, have some of the most impressive public transportation systems in the world. They have incredible security systems, cameras on every corner. They have really nice hospitals, high rises, and a whole host of public work projects that are simply designed to improve the cachet of the Chinese Communist Party. So amidst all this economic growth and improvement, the average person in China still has a relatively low income, comparable more to, say, Mexico or Brazil. The state-owned enterprises are pretty much managed by government leaders, either directly, where a government leader will make decisions for the company, or indirectly, where the government leader will appoint the executives. So you can see the political class controls the funding to the enterprises and the management of those enterprises. That means being a government leader or being connected to a government leader is a huge advantage. Family connections matter when the government has so much control over the economic outcomes in the economy. It's no different than in other countries. It's just that in the US or in the UK or Germany, you have a smaller government in terms of economic decision making. So being a family member of a government official doesn't matter as much. But in China, the government has a lot of influence over the economy, and therefore being a family member of those political insiders is much more advantageous. There's a name given to the offspring of political leaders that profit from their family connections. They're called princelings. So there is income inequality in China. Some of it is a product of the advancement of capitalism and markets in terms of allocation. That naturally brings about more inequality, but a lot of it has to do with these inside connections that the political class have and benefit from. Okay, let's talk about savings rates. Saving rates in China are very high. In fact, they are in some cases upwards of 30 to 40%. Compare that to the US, where our saving rates are usually in the 0 to 8% range. Why would savings rates be so high? Well, believe it or not, saving rates tend to be highest in countries that are poor, not abject poor, because clearly there's nothing to save if you're barely surviving. But when you have poor countries that have a basic standard of living, they're fed, they're clothed, they have housing, then oftentimes saving rates are high. First explanation is there's a meager retirement welfare system. Simply put, people have to save because the government's not going to take care of them unless they're a state employee. And even then, it's not an impressive retirement. Limited credit available to household. We already saw that the state banks are funding state enterprises, not households. So you don't go to a bank in China to get a loan to buy, a laptop computer or get a loan to buy furniture. You save up for those things. Recent memory of famine, chaos, and uncertainty. This is similar to what we saw in the US after the Great Depression, where it ushered forward a generation of savers. It also is exemplified by the Weimar Republic in Germany after World War I, where there was such extreme economic unrest that people saved large amounts of money to protect themselves. Uncertainty about the future increases savings because people have to prepare for that. And with Mao Zedong and his great leap forward and cultural revolution, there's still recent memories of that chaos, and people are proactive by saving. A culture of self-reliance and familial support. Some will say this goes back to Confucius. Regardless of the genesis, there are certain cultures that value that kind of independence and self-reliance. And the familial support is important because in poorer regions, you see family members having to take care of other family members. And so you're not just saving to protect for yourself, you're saving to protect those that you love. Another thing that I'll add to this that I think is important is in poorer countries, there may not be a lot to buy. Now, China is not in that category anymore, but China for many years, even a couple decades after Mao Zedong died, was still such a low-income country and low-producing country that there just wasn't a lot of things for people to buy. And keep in mind that the Chinese were producing goods for export. That's how they built their economic growth rates so high. They were producing manufactured goods to send to America and Europe and other parts of the world, not goods for their own people. That means that if there's nothing to buy, then people are more inclined to save. The Chinese did not get any formal property rights until 2003. And even thereafter, the property rights are very limited. The state essentially owns everything, like any communist country. But the state authorizes people to use property through leases, right? They might give you a certain time frame where you can use the property and pay them, or through implicit contracts, meaning that they're going to let you use it, but there's no formal explicit contract, so they can take that back when they want. Even if there was an explicit contract, however, there is a lack of unbiased courts. Courts are biased. That means that they will typically side in favor of the government over the individual. Because of the lack of property right protections, entering into contracts in China can be challenging. Because when you enter into a contract, you're essentially creating a future transaction. And it means that if one party doesn't come through on that transaction, you need some sort of adjudicator that's going to be objective, unbiased, and look at the evidence and rule. But in China, there is not that kind of rule of law. And as a result, the contracts that people enter into are often more of a relational type of contract. You almost have to know the person you're doing business with in order to trust that they will live up to their obligation. Maybe you only do business with family members or people that you've done business with for years previously. A lot of the familial kind of connections matter here, because if you are young, you may have not entered into a contract with anybody, but if your family has done business with them for years, you'll trust them. You see, the difference between relational contracting and what we see in other parts of the world is it's harder to do business with strangers. In the US, I can write up a contract with anybody. I don't have to know them. And I know that if they don't come through on that contract, then I can go to a court which will be unbiased, look at the evidence, and rule accordingly. But I can't depend on that in China. So I would only do business with people that I trust and already have a relationship with. Clearly, that reduces the number of contracts that can occur, and it undermines the ability to grow business and expand the economy. It also hurts foreign investment, because foreigners want to know that when they put their money into the Chinese economy and enter into contracts with people to do business there, that those contracts are going to be respected. So you can see how important protecting private property rights are. To the extent the Chinese government doesn't do this, they undermine the economic growth and prosperity that can be achieved. However, as an autocratic government, there may be more important reasons to restrain private property rights. Corporatization is the act of converting an enterprise into a corporation. That is, selling shares of ownership on a stock exchange to anybody that wants to buy them. And that's exactly what China did with the ex-state-owned enterprises that were small and less important. You know, the textile industry, the entertainment industry, the restaurant industry, things like that. Corporatization has the effect of making economic metrics more important than political metrics. For obvious reasons. Investors, people that buy shares of stock, are looking for a return, and they're not going to put their money into a business unless they believe that business will generate a return. So these corporations tend to be more efficient. They tend to produce products that align more with what consumers want and less what the government officials want. And they become a haven for foreign investment, because foreigners are more inclined to invest in businesses where there's that level of accountability to shareholders, rather than invest in businesses where the accountability is to the Communist Party. In other words, corporatization has helped bring in a lot of funds from abroad into China and helped grow the economy. It is a little misleading, though, because many of the corporations in China are selling shares on an exchange, but the government may actually own a lot of those shares, leading to that political influence that investors would not like. In 2001, China was successful at getting membership into the World Trade Organization. This is an international trade organization that is designed to facilitate trade, set up rules for trade, regulate trade, all of that kind of stuff. And China becoming a member was a tremendous boost to its international cachet. By agreeing to abide by rules like copyright laws, trademarks, visas, business licenses, foreign bank competition, and protection of domestic industries, China was embraced by the rest of the world. Now, the controversy today is, of course, that China is not living up to these rules. Copyright law and trademark law has been violated in many parts of China. It's easy to get a knockoff Gucci or Louis Vuitton product on the street. Very few police are enforcing that. Also, foreign bank competition was a big one, but the Chinese government has given advantages to its state-owned banks over foreign banks that operate in China, and therefore few foreign competitors emerge. And then China does protect its domestic industries. It subsidizes them with lower taxes and lower interest rates and even more favorable regulation. So China's WTO membership is still there, but definitely a bone of contention with other members.